Our panel chair is my colleague Catherine Grant, who's a lecturer in art and visual cultures at Goldsmiths, and she is working on reenactment in contemporary art as an art historian, focusing on the question of how to bring histories of feminism to life. And the beginning of Catherine's research appeared as the article Fans of Feminism, Rewriting Histories of Second Wave Feminism in Contemporary Art in the Oxford Art Journal in 2011, and she's also co-edited the book Girls, Girls, Girls in Contemporary Art, and the special issue of the journal, Creative Writing and Art History.
So thank you very much to Helena for inviting me to chair this session, and also to the rest of the Now You Can Go curatorial team for putting this together. As Helena says, we're going to kind of change gears a little bit, change tone. I'm not really speaking as an expert of Carla Lonzi's work, but we're really thinking about different ways of withdrawing from the art world and re-engaging in different ways. So I'm just going to give some opening remarks to frame this. So we're going to hear from three people who have refused or withdrawn from conventional art world structures. This doesn't mean they're no longer artists, but rather that they have interrogated how a successful artistic practice is constituted and refused or reworked it. When thinking about this series and the model of Carla Lonzi's withdrawal from the art world, I've been puzzling over what this withdrawal might lead to. In Lonzi's hands, withdrawal from art allows an engagement with politics, but this engagement also insists on a radical analysis and re-signification of subjectivity, relationships, and creativity. As Claire Fontaine have put it in their discussion of her book, Now You Can Go, this is a quote, "Subjectivity sieved by the practice of feminist consciousness raising is the true protagonist of this book. The journal is a document of experimentation within relationships and a recollection of the profound changes that are from this experimentation." And where perhaps I depart from Claire Fontaine's analysis is where this experimentation leads. Rather than a radical destructive space of potential revolt, I've been imagining it in rather more modest terms which would probably remain compromised under the terms that Fulvia and Claire Fontaine have theorised it. Nevertheless, this is how I've been imagining the process. Do less, think more. These two sentences have been my way of imagining a withdrawal. And then alongside this, I've added two more commands. Do less, think more, talk to each other, do something differently. And when looking at Carla Cruz's website, I was struck by a quote by Adrienne Rich that she had posted. I think that for me, this frames a possibility that all three of our speakers have found in collective organisation beyond the traditional art world and art star system, one that engages feminist politics in a rethinking of our communities and commitments to each other. So I'm going to read it. It's from Adrienne Rich's 1976 essay, Conditions for Work, The Common World of Women. The problem, finally, is not of who does the housework and the childcare, whether or not one can find a life companion who will share in the sustenance and repair of daily life, crucial as these may be in the short run. It is a question of the community we are reaching for in our work and on which we can draw, whom we envision as our hearers, our co-creators, our challengers, who will urge us to take our work further, more seriously than we had dared, on whose work we can build. Women have done these things for each other, sought each other in community, even if only in enclaves, often through correspondence, for centuries. Denied space in the universities, the scientific laboratories, the professions, we have devised our networks. We must not be tempted to trade the possibility of enlarging and strengthening those networks and of extending them to more and more women for the illusion of power and success as exceptional or privileged women in the professions. So, I think kind of this sort of gives us the ground of some of the politics that our speakers are going to be speaking from. And I also just wanted to acknowledge that today we are speaking in the Showroom, an organisation that has a very strong commitment to thinking about communities and their relationship to art, particularly under the directorship of Emily Pethick and through the work of Louise Shelley. It's no coincidence that two of our speakers have collaborated with the Showroom. So we're going to now hear 10-minute presentations from our speakers. So I'll introduce all of them first, and then we will hear about their practice. Okay, so Caroline Russell did an MFA in Fine Art at Goldsmiths in the mid-80s and showed work at the Whitechapel, the Hayward, and as part of the British Art Show. She retrained as a civil engineer and followed a path that she described as studying medicine for the built environment. She subsequently stopped making art and worked as a campaigner for pedestrians and cycles, and she is currently the Green Party councillor for Highbury East in Islington and looks likely to become a London Assembly member. And Caroline said when I was emailing her, I viewed community campaigning rather like a massive conceptual artwork, which I thought was a brilliant frame for what you may speak about today. And then we're going to hear from Carla Cruz, who's a London-based artist from Portugal, whose project All My Independent Women experiments with forms of collectivity, the erasure of authorship, and practices that take place outside and in defiance of mainstream art systems. She's generated a cultural community centre in, I don't know how to say this city. No, I know it's Walthamstow. in rural Portugal.
Oh yes, Guimarães.
Guimarães. Or Walthamstow, they're very similar. She's recently completed the residency Finding Money at Open School East, and she has initiated the Walthamstow Performing Arts Collective in 2014. The exotic place of Walthamstow. And finally, we're going to be hearing from Andrea Francke, who's a Peruvian artist, also based in London, interested in feminist and queer politics, who use art as a space for knowledge production and testing of models for a different future. And many of you probably know her ongoing project, Invisible Spaces of Parenthood, which has been ongoing since 2010, in collaboration with Kim Dillon, as well as other projects such as the Piracy Project. So I would like to welcome Caroline to the podium as our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you also to Helena for inviting me. It's very, very odd to be back in an art world situation. It's a long time since I kind of encountered the kind of seminar that we sat through or panel discussion we sat through just earlier. Yes, I'm Caroline Russell. I am a councillor in Islington for the Green Party. And I'm going to run through a little bit of the journey that I went on to get from the art world to where I am now, and then kind of just run through some things about my work as a politician that kind of relates back to art practice, and I think, you know, some really interesting connections and things that are happening at the moment. Yes, I had a practice as an artist. I did the master's course at Goldsmiths. And my work was about display, about the act of viewing, about how value is made, and was, you know, involved very minimal interventions into buildings. And I reached a point with my work where I was probably going to need to employ an engineer. And being a bit of a purist and slightly naive, I thought I will go and study engineering. I will be a civil engineer so that I can make these decisions for myself. And I set off on a journey that I had no idea it was going to end up bringing me here. I started with one small baby on a maths and physics foundation course, which is the equivalent of maths and physics A-level that you do in 1 year, because not only was I slightly naive about becoming an engineer, I did need to get myself a maths and physics A-level before I could do it. So I did that year. I did the first year of the engineering course. I then took a year out because I had our second child. I then went back and finished the civil engineering degree. Very interesting doing an engineering degree. I was one of 4 women amongst 56 students in my year. It's a very, very male environment. And it's one of the things that sort of transport seminars and meetings, there is never a queue for the loo because there are very few women in that world. Anyway, I completed the degree. I now look back on my notes from that period with this sort of incredibly complex maths calculations that would go on for sort of several sides of paper. I now can't remember how to do any of it. I'm sure I could if I did a sort of refresher course. I got to the end of the degree, started, having all sorts of ideas about how I might start taking that back into, possibly into an art practice, and even actually sort of working as an engineer. I then found I was pregnant with our third child, and I decided, I've got children, I'm actually going to be mum for a bit. And I got involved in community politics and something that connected back to the engineering, which was transport campaigning. There was a horrific incident on the road where I live, where a family were walking to school one morning, and the youngest, who was the same age, would have been the same age as my middle daughter, who's now 19, was killed by a heavy goods vehicle which crushed her pushchair. And I just thought, it is absolutely wrong that anyone walking their kids to school risks one of their children not making it to the school gates. And I got involved in transport campaigning about reducing road death, making sure that our streets are safe for people to walk, cycle, and get around in our city. I also got involved in campaigning against turkey twizzlers on the school dinners menu, got involved in procurement issues, bottom-up, community-led change to the world that I was living in. I was also chair of governors of my kids' school, which anyone who's done it knows is an incredibly full-time activity, but actually, you learn an awful lot of stuff. So, in 2009, I was approached by the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party, and also the Greens in Islington, asking me if I'd like to stand to be a councillor in 2010. I was one of those people who was very active in the community, always speaking out, always doing stuff, and they all wanted me to come and join their gang. After actually probably not quite enough thought, decided I'd join the Green Party, which is not, for anyone who knows anything about politics, the quickest route to electoral success. It took 5 years for me to get elected. I got elected by 8 votes, and I am the only non-Labour councillor on Islington Council. So it is me sitting in the leader of the opposition seat and 47 Labour councillors ranged all the way round the room. I'm about 5 minutes in, am I? Just good, excellent, just checking. So getting elected is actually a really serious business. My ward, Highbury East Ward, has huge amounts of inequality and huge numbers of people who are unbelievably wealthy. And by definition, the people moving in who are moving into owner-occupied properties are richer than the people moving out, and those moving into social housing have more needs than those people moving out, because there's such a shortage of homes that in order to get up the list enough to be able to get a social rent home in Islington, you've got to have so many points. You're really, really struggling. There's very little movement within the social housing in Islington. There's very few new homes. The first piece of casework I got was someone writing to me who lived on the Highbury Quadrant estate, complaining about mopeds being burnt out outside his window and kids just hanging out there burning mopeds pretty much every evening. These are the mopeds that are being used for phone snatches and for drug deals, and sadly also for knife crimes. We've had in Islington in this last year 3 young people die because they've been killed by knife crime. So it's serious stuff being elected. As a sole opposition councillor, there's not an awful lot you can do. I don't have that much power, but I have been able to raise issues. And I'm just going to give you sort of 1 or 2 kind of examples of things that I've been able to do before I sort of move on to talk about, how it all connects up back to the art world, because I think it probably does. Another person came to me who worked for the council for green space, but she was on an agency contract. She'd been on an agency contract for 4 years. That meant that she wasn't eligible to apply for apprenticeships to actually better herself. She'd been on an agency contract since she was 17, working for the council, but she was still stuck with no job security and able to be let go at a couple of weeks' notice, just from a phone call. And she said it happened to people all the time when the seasonal busyness of working in our parks and open spaces ends at the end of the summer. So I asked questions in the council, and I managed to get them to bring all their agency workers in green space in-house, so they all now have proper jobs and they get redeployed on other things at other times of year. That's just a little thing, but actually that kind of job security, there are so many people living in our city who have no job security, who don't know how they're going to pay the rent next month, and who are struggling by on poverty wages. And it's just completely wrong. We have these massive corporations that are getting away without paying any corporation tax and not paying people properly, so that people are left dependent on benefits just to be able to pay their rent, keep a roof over their head, stay warm, feed their children, clothe their children. We're all seeing it, wherever we work in London, we will all be familiar with people who are struggling, really struggling to get by. And yet these massive corporations are getting away without paying their corporation tax and without actually paying people properly and doing the right thing. And I think that's sort of like an overarching context that we're all living in. It also connects with the housing crisis, where we have this housing bubble, where properties are being bought and sold as commodities on, before they've even been built. They're being sold in Hong Kong or somewhere else with glossy brochures. The building of these properties has absolutely nothing to do with providing homes for Londoners. The only affordable homes are completely unaffordable to anyone on an ordinary salary. You have to be earning about £80,000 a year to be able to buy some of these affordable, so-called affordable homes in some of the big developments that are happening in London. So, how do you actually get to sort of do something that starts making a difference if you are just a lone councillor in a borough like Islington? Few things I've done recently. The Prevent legislation, which some of you may be aware of, which is this anti-extremism legislation. I kept having people talk to me about it, the impact of it. Finsbury Park Mosque, which was, when Abu Hamza was running the mosque, a hotbed of extremism, and weapons were found there. Abu Hamza is quite rightly in prison now. But Mohammed Kosbar, who's been running the mosque ever since Abu Hamza left, has done an amazing job at reaching out to the community, bringing people in. And when there was an arson attack there a week ago on Friday, last Friday, we all turned up at the mosque. We all spoke out, expressed our solidarity with the mosque, and that was people from across Islington, of all faiths, different kinds of community groups. It was really positive, really heartwarming. So there is good work going on, but the Prevent legislation is horrific. It kind of it sort of curbs free speech. It makes many people living in my ward have expressed their anxiety about the experience of their children at school. One woman from Algeria told me just on Friday this week that her child had been asked what religion he was in a Spanish class, and he'd refused to say. He was worried to say that he was Muslim. And the Spanish teacher spoke to the mother. This sort of thing, it made the mum felt terrible. We don't want to have communities afraid to express what their religion is or be able to discuss things at school. So I put a motion to Islington Council, which was backed by Islington Council, all the Labour councillors, which was that we would make sure that in Islington the Prevent legislation is enacted in a way that involves community, that works in a bottom-up way, and that is absolutely not about a tick box exercise to snitch on children saying things at school, and where you end up with things like there was a really massively reported case recently where a child was speaking in a French lesson about eco-terrorism, and rather than being praised for his use of French vocabulary, he was questioned about links to ISIS afterwards by people who came into the school. So, thank you. Okay, so I am currently standing for the London Assembly and am looking for different kinds of ideas for London that could make our city a better place. I've recently been supporting students at the CAS who've been trying to prevent their art college from being closed down. I've been supporting residents in a communal group home in Islington who've been living there for 40 years, mixed needs group, who have been resisting eviction by one housing group. They have a different model for living. They live 18 of them together, some escaping domestic violence, an elderly ex-social worker who's lived there for over for 40 years with Parkinson's disease. They look after each other, they support each other. They have 3 fridges, 3 cookers and 3 washing machines between the 18 of them. It's a very economical way to live. It's also a different way of living in that they are supporting one another and not dependent on social services. So I'm interested in ideas for different ways of doing things in our city that will make our city a better, greener and happier place for everyone to live together. There you go.
I would like to thank Elena and all of those involved in the Feminist Iterations Reading Group for organizing this series of events. I will be talking about leaving the art world, or an attempt to exit a certain art world's logic that is done collectively and prefiguratively. So through my career as an artist, I often felt uncomfortable in this given logic of the art world that you might call mainstream, and spent a lot of time thinking of exiting, of retraining as something else, and actually realizing that the way that I've been performing my practice, or practicing, and positioning myself in the art world was constituting acts of self-exclusion. These acts of withdrawal have recently attracted scholarship, interest in diverse tactics of pulling out, which can create a paradox where we repatriate back to the art world with our studies, lectures, and articles, practices that have been taken elsewhere. So what is at stake when someone abdicates from the art world altogether? Why are we bringing these practices back to the visibility within the arts discourses? And what does this do to them? So these are questions that I think we should also approach today. And are there other ways we can negotiate the regulatory framework that currently exists in the mainstream art world? And how can we avoid being dark matter to the successful few, to use Gregory Cholet's term to describe the majority of practitioners, that is, all of us involved in cultural production and consumption in some manner or form? Perhaps one of the things that we need to challenge is the idea of a singular art world, a visibility operating on one singular plane. And another is refraining to treat withdrawal and exit as isolated and individual actions. Instead, my experience suggests that many artists are building networks of solidarity elsewhere, in the margins, within, but also against the center-periphery logic. And here I would like to talk about a project I've initiated in 2005, a feminist exhibition project and network that forged a place to withdraw to, either partially or totally, but nonetheless together with others. So this is All My Independent Women. All My Independent Women deals thematically with the representation of women through the artworks that are presented in its exhibitions. The artists are not exclusively women. They are people who identified as woman, man, as transgender, but use feminist methodologies and an embodied position to produce artistic gestures. Moreover, All My Independent Women uses curatorial strategies to question the invisibility of these artists in the art world, who see their work marginalized or consciously marginalize their work because of the subject matter and methodology. In All My Independent Women, representation appears both as aesthetics, as depiction, as occupying a place in the sensible, and as a claim for difference, that is to say, a difference that proposes an alternative, that acts. All My Independent Women discusses constructions of sexual and gender differences, but also attempts to create a space where the visibility of these artists is no longer measured against the center. So this wasn't so from the beginning. In 2005, in Portugal, where I initiated it, I believed that the art world did not acknowledge artistic practices that dealt with gender and feminist critique. I organized All My Independent Women in order to fight for the recognition of these practices, to insert them in a given logic in the mainstream. So visibility was a central question. All My Independent Women was a marginal project that hoped at some point to become central. In its beginning, central according to this logic, this art world logic. It was only after the 2010 exhibition, the 5th one, that the prospect of our feminist discourses being peacefully absorbed by the mainstream art discourse without bringing any real change became manifest. When I started to question, what does it mean to want to inscribe feminist art practices in the visible art arena? knowing that the very constructions of what is rendered visible and what is not is actually what you need to figure out. Reclaiming a form of visibility without it being transformative runs the risk of absorption into the visible, the canon, in a neoliberal procedure, where differences are transformed into anodyne characteristics, welcomed and quickly absorbed in an ever-growing pluralist society that on the one hand acknowledges those differences and celebrates them, and on the other cancels out their political potential. So after 2010, All My Independent Women started to position itself as a project of solidarity. And here I should mention a particular characteristic of All My Independent Women and its 8 instantiations. All My Independent Women is a network of friends. It started by being an exhibition of 15 artists whose common denominator was working from a feminist perspective and being related to me in some way or another. They shared a studio with me, studied with, worked, collaborated with. Today, the network is composed of over 90 artists, so you can see here the majority of the names. And it grew from the same logic: friends we knew, friends we meet along the way, and that affiliated to the project. So I became less interested in promoting individual artists or collectives and inserting them into a given logical of the art world, and more interested in subverting that logic by recollectivizing our practices, by forging our own central node. It is in this moment that All My Independent Women marginal position became a very comfortable place to be. This place where before we felt that we were thrown into, excluded to, became the place we wanted to inhabit. All My Independent Women's situatedness in what can be perceived as the margins of the art world, but nonetheless the center of All My Independent Women's counterpublic, allows us to articulate our aims not just within the art sphere, but in relation to the world itself, and imagine new possibilities of being and making in the different spheres we operate in. From where we stand, we can propose our own fictions for the creation of the self, but also for the production of art. And here, I would like to show another image. Okay, so now I would like to refer very quickly. I've recently done 2 workshops with students from a school just down the road, from King Solomon Academy, on solidarity and friendship. And on the last session, I've asked them to, well, we discussed for about 30 minutes the notion of solidarity. I've asked them to outline their hands, to cut it, and to write inside the hand a word that would relate to solidarity and the discussion that we had. And then I've asked them to arrange, was actually on this wall, the hands. And what I've noticed is that they were trying to, each one of them was trying to put the hand the highest possible, to glue it the highest. And the aim of the exercise was to look then at all the words that they collected and discussed them. And then I felt actually what we had to discuss was why they arranged their hands in that manner. So I've asked them to, if they could rearrange the position of their hands that could shape what was their definition of solidarity. And funny enough, after discussion and having to vote for the shape, this is what they come up with. And they justify it by saying that solidarity is teamwork, is all together, going towards a goal. And of course, that goal is up. And it really struck me as strange, because All My Independent Women is in exact opposition to this idea of solidarity, of all of us moving towards something higher, some horizon, where what we actually want to do is perhaps slowly stay where we are and reconstruct that we're moving towards to. This is it.
Thank you so much. Helena and everybody who organized the conference, I'm super happy to be here. I was a member of the audience in the conference at Goldsmiths, and I have been to some of the reading groups, and I didn't know anything about Italian feminism, and I've been slowly catching up, and it has been something quite influential and kind of helped me. I don't know if it's going to be apparent, but I think it's helping me rethink a lot of the stuff that I do. So the way I thought, I'm just going to talk slowly about the moment that I think my practice began. And I was thinking about this and the title of the conference, and I realized that I think my practice is born of this conflict about wanting to be in and wanting desperate to leave as well, and not really knowing how to deal with this, with these two different positions. So in one sense, being so aware that the art world is not the space for everybody or any subject or any type of voice or any type of history, especially in a way that they have agency. So sometimes certain subjectivities or certain bodies are accepted, but they're kind of objectified through that acceptance. And so this is, I moved to London to study. I'm Peruvian, but I grew up in Brazil. And I did my postgraduate diploma at Chelsea. And I had a partner at a time, and I had a baby, and I thought everything was fine. I'm one of those people. I'm one of the generation that thought everything was solved, and we didn't have to fight any battles, so just went, had a kid, thought everything was perfect. Decided to go back to do an MA. Chelsea is part of UIL, so they had a nursery. So I thought, this is perfect. The university has a nursery, means that it's okay, like everything has been solved. I can be part of this. So I went and I started doing my MA, and then I remember that I actually really hate art, and I had a horrible time. And I decided I was going to learn how to do furniture because I'm a foreign student, so I had to pay a lot of money to come here and study, which is another thing to discuss in terms of like different levels of privilege. But yeah, so I decided, my mom had used to make furniture using DIY manuals, so I said, perfect, I'm going to use this money. Chelsea has a beautiful workshop. I'm going to learn how to make furniture during this year, and then I'll have a profession, and I can leave and not be an artist anymore. So I was quite happy with that. And then after 4 or 5 months that this has started happening, this is my son, the furniture, the university decided to close the nursery. And it was a very last minute thing, and there were about 50 people women mostly, that depended on the nursery, be staff or teachers and students. And we organized and we tried to fight, and there were all these student protests. So I thought, well, what I can do to help is I can go to General Theory Forum, which is when all the students are there, and people will come and say, let's join this protest about tuition, let's join this protest, and just go in front of them and said, let's put the nursery in the protest because the nursery is being closed. And then suddenly all these people that were fighting for these leftist ideals and all these different students that I knew personally turned to me and said, you made a decision, you're a mother. Have you ever heard of an artist who's a mother? Why would we care? And it was such a violent experience of otherness, of this art world that I didn't want to be part of, saying you cannot be part of it. But I think this is where my dual position comes, that I was like, there's no way you get to tell me if I can be here or I cannot be here. And to understand what are these voices that then get excluded. We failed massively in our protest, and the nursery was closed. And it was basically purely an ideological reasons, because at the moment that we managed to prove that it was not financial, the position of the university was like, we don't care, this is being closed and this is not a discussion. But what ended up happening, which I think is really interesting, is that the people that had other means could find really, really late minute solutions. And the people that thought, like I thought, because of a certain specific type of background that I come from, that I had the right to fight to be there, stayed. And there were 2 girls who were doing their BAs, and there were single mothers. There were young black girls who were the first people in their families to decide to go to university, and had like a massive fight to prove to the families that they could occupy that position, and there were the people that left the courses. So I think what it made visible to me, and really I remember someone mentioned Spade today before, and these books about administration and policy is like how these decisions that look quite neutral, they're not neutral. They affect very specific groups of people, and they're very effective in telling certain groups of people, you're not allowed to be to have a voice in the art world, you're not allowed to participate. So for my final show, so basically my practice was born out of incredible anger and rage and failure. So but I had a space, I had an MA, so I had a room at the final show. So what I did was I worked with some of the people that were involved in the nursery as staff members, as workers, or staff members of the university, or professors or students. And I think that the fact that I work with nursery assistants, I was always really interested, and it's something that I've kept on doing, is the thing that there cannot be a discussion about motherhood without including the people that also are included in the labor of motherhood. So the idea of like that you can just like get your oppression and pass it to somebody else is not really solving anybody's problems. So I organized this space, and we designed this nursery that was sort of an utopia nursery, and kind of designed the toys and had this history, and went through all the health and safety and insurance negotiations that children could be allowed inside the university for this. And it was amazing, and people would come, and a lot of the people that were involved in the protest would come and have conversations and start showing to people that this wasn't a personal problem, that, for example, there were almost no female teachers in UIL before the nursery was set up, that the nursery was a feminist fight in itself, and it had a history. Lots of mothers would come and walk with their children, and some kids will say, well, you know, this has nothing to do, this is nothing, this is a nursery. And then a mother will pull a 20-year-old inside of the room and say, well, do you know what I had to do when you were growing up? Do you know how this negotiation was? Or even make visible the position of women who, for a period of time, or like in different ways, decided to stay with their kids or not use the nursery, which I think is also a really interesting position. And although I do a lot of things around policy and nurseries, I think one of the things that I'm really interested in early years is that it just makes so visible that you cannot have one solution that kind of sorts everything, which I think is really interesting. I think in like kind of neoliberal politics, when you kind of find a format and you're like, yes, this is what's going to solve, this is like the proper behavior. I'm really into queer theory as well, so it's like the idea that you have like one path, and you know, every woman should have a nursery and should put their kid in the nursery when they're 6 months, and it's like every child is a child and every mother is a mother or a father, sometimes they're single fathers. There's like every group of people have different necessities and different needs and different positions of how they want to carry on these relations, but this should not stop them to being kind of heard as political voices. And I think, yeah, I guess this was 2009, I think. So this project is still going, and I still do a lot of work with around these issues now with Kim Dillon, and campaigns in, not only campaigns for nursery, for example, there were a college, which is something that Kim has had a lot more involved than I have been, but I'm really interested in these places as political spaces, and why are they so invisible, and why are these objects of motherhood invisible. But there's an amazing Schuster Center called the Pullman just around the corner, and it's one of the most politicized places I've ever been. And the workers there are just incredibly politicized, and they're understanding, like the pedagogy they practice is really radical pedagogy, and it's done in an environment that is public, it's universal, that attend very different types of people, and their voices are never heard. There's this place that is a ghost somehow. Whenever the art world is talking about education, it's always talking about school, or it's talking always about universities, and I'm really interested in why these spaces that are all the time thinking about being these symbols of political agency, where the children are seen as valid political subjects, and the workers are seen as political subjects, and the users and the families are seen as political subjects, and they all have to work together, are kind of ignored. I think that's Yeah.